Alrighty, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Subscribing to My Podcast. Because I have a new guest featured every week, it makes it very difficult to maintain consistent viewership. So if there's one thing that you can do to support me or the guest featured on the show, it's by interacting with my channel in every way that you can. You can always decide to unsubscribe later if you decide that you hate me or my show. With that plugging aside, enjoy my discussion with Radell Lewis, also known as the Purple Political Breakdown on YouTube, is somebody that I found when searching for really people to talk to who are in the political scene right now, particularly people who are of my size, just to get a much more local view of what's going on. And then I ended up looking and stalking at some of his videos, and it seems like he's actually interested in doing some local politics as well in Ohio. So I'm interested to bridge that gap between some of this bigger politics and then how we can break it down to the lower level, more local politics. So Radell, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and then tell some of the viewers some important things that they should know about you.
Yeah, as he said, my name is Radell. I'm the host of a podcast called the Purple Political Breakdown. My intention behind the podcast and what I try to do is focus on political solutions. I've talked to a variety of different people all across the spectrum and focus narrowly on ways to improve the country. Now, more so recently, because I think MAGA and Donald Trump is an existential threat to the United States of America, I've been focusing on showing the people what they really are. But ultimately, I have no interest to play the politics game or choose between left and right. Typically, if I see something that is bad, I will call it out. As simple as that. So right now, as he said, I am focusing on practicing what I'm preaching and showcasing that local politics is way more important to you as an individual compared to the craziness that's happening with the federal government at the moment.
Yeah, well, let's set the scene, I guess. I'm sure that a lot of people with their political biases are aware of some of the stuff that's going on, but I guess their view of it nationally is probably really influenced by their partisan nature. So I guess, can you give me your overhead, bird's eye view of the current national political scene right now?
The current political national scene is very polarized. I think we all understand that. The amount of conversations that I began with guests, one of the things that we always started with is discussing the divisive nature of current day politics. The divide is as big as it's ever been. I say something as extreme as this is probably the most divided we've been since the Civil War. And as time goes by, it's getting even more and more divisive. It's not good. It's really, I dare I say, dangerous when it comes down to bringing up your political viewpoint to the average person nowadays. Imagine going out to a random area, maybe you go to a sports game, maybe you go to a bar, depending on what state you're in. If you say you're a Trump supporter or if you're anti-Trump, because honestly, it starts and stops with Donald Trump and what his politics have done to the country, you can get in a very tense situation, maybe even aggressive situation. So it's very divided. It's very important. And I do think as of right now, when people look at the national stage, a lot of them don't really understand what is truly going on, which is what I try to help people with and make people understand in the simplest way I can. Because when it comes down to government and politics, it's not a very simple thing to kind of understand if you're an average person who's working at 9 to 5 every single day. I don't blame you.
Yeah, and I don't know. To me, the origin of where this comes from isn't super important, but if it's being perpetuated by a specific group that happens to be the origin of it, I think that's where it becomes important. So I guess, where do you think this comes from, or where do you think this gets continued by? Why is this polarization happening in the way that, you've just described?
Trying to find a origin point is very difficult. And honestly, it doesn't really matter. One thing I will say is that there was a level of ignorance on part of not necessarily the Democrats or even the Republicans, but government in general, in thinking that the way they run the government is a way that is going to satisfy the people. And when it comes down to a lot of metrics, you can definitely say there's a lot of improvement. I tried to tell people that you don't really understand what you have until you take a step back. When you compare the United States to the rest of the world, when you compare the United States to its own history, there's no denying we have come a far away. There's no denying there's so much privilege that people have. You can literally deliver food any day of the week if you feel like it. You can spend all day playing video games. Now we have AI technology that can basically do anything you want. Now, these are great privileges, for sure. One thing that has been ignored is the dissatisfaction between the people when it comes down to living out the promise that they've been told their entire lives, the American dream, living out the job that's supposed to help them create a family, that's supposed to help them be joyful. One thing that I preach all the time is enjoy life because it's important. Nobody has a set principle on what it means to be a human being, whether you bring that to religion or not, which is also dwindling, and culture is dwindling as well. With that said, because the government has ignored this growing dissent, the increased gap of the wealthy and the poor, and people who, yes, things have been getting better, but that doesn't mean that they're happy with their situation, it caused a opening for someone like Donald Trump to come in and take advantage of it. And there is fault in the far left as well. Honestly, the left in general with certain social policies that I would say got a little wokish and went too far, obviously exaggerated at this point when it's used by MAGA, but ultimately it was ammunition. The dissatisfaction, the wokeness, all of it became ammunition for a man to use the people's dissatisfaction to his own gain. And that's exactly what happened as of right now. So there's a multifaceted factors on how we got here. But one thing that is undeniable is that the government wasn't really listening to the people.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's much I would, add or question in that. I think that the internet has done a pretty particular job of magnifying specific groups of people to kind of extrapolate this issue. It kind of gave this perfect layup for the Republicans to kind of dunk on people when you have people on Twitter who are saying that my 3-year-old is trans. Because I feel like a lot of people on the left who are somewhat supportive of this kind of nature, even they would look at that and be like, that's a little much for me. I don't think that's true. We should move away from that. But because of the way that the internet is and the way that there was this instant spotlight that could be put on people for denouncing that, you had the left defending some crazy things, even though they don't actually believe that to be the case. And so you had this internet like spotlight effect that I think forced people to like shriek and hide. And for a while, especially around Trump's presidency, you had people like Crowder, like Ben Shapiro, who had these like, based Republican destroys crying SJW on, you know what I mean? And this kind of, proliferated like this exact problem that you're happening. So I agree that I don't see where the origin is super important, but I think that if an aspect of this, if we're wanting it to change, is we have to stop defending this kind of behavior. And I think that the baton has been passed to MAGA for this election in that they're defending some outrageous behavior from Trump, even though I don't think that the Republican Party actually likes this stuff. And I don't think that they would have supported this even 5 years ago. But again, because of that spotlight effect of the internet, they're being forced to. I guess, do you have any thoughts on the distinction between like current MAGA and current Republicans in this kind of pathway?
Try to be very clear in how I talk about MAGA. I say it all the time. I don't think MAGA is Republican. I think they're a new group. You could argue that this is a shifting of party identity, as happened throughout American history when eventually the Democrats became a thing. When it comes down to MAGA, a lot of the principles that they care about or said that they cared about was using republicanism as a guiding principle. But eventually it got completely misconstrued. As you said, that they are willing to defend things that they truly inherently, as a Republican, should never defend. Things going against the Constitution and your unalienable rights of the Bill of Rights in general should be something that the Republicans hold dear to their hearts, like the Bible. But even Bible principles I do think is getting tested. So when it comes down to MAGA right now, there are some type of like fake populists where they believe that the country is embedded with these corrupt individuals, but also turn a blind eye to the corruption that is going on currently. It's the idea that there's this shadow deep state that has taken over the world, that has taken over everything. And it's this ultra nationalism where we might ultra national Christian nationalism as well. Well, it seems like they're trying to return to a time that they can't truly identify, but we all know exactly what they're referring to. So this is not republicanism anymore. It's definitely far more extreme and way more unprincipled.
Yeah, and it's hard to understand the machine that keeps this kind of idea operating. I feel like a really good litmus test for this idea is just to describe exactly what Trump is doing and then ask if literally any other president was doing it. And I feel like most Republicans would be like, no, if they were sending the National Guard to like different states to loom over them, that would not be great. If they had this like crypto coin scam that was happening, that would not be good. If you just describe the incidents from January 6th and then you describe the speech that happened beforehand, you'd be like, no, this is all terrible. Like, imagine if a Democrat had done this. But for some reason, this just doesn't work. I see this tactic employed with Republicans and they'll be like, yeah, this would be bad. Like, they just bite the bullet. They're like, yeah, it would be bad if another president did it, but it's good when my president does this because blank. I don't understand it. Do you have any like insight into this kind of like defense? I don't know how they play ball with this kind of idea. I struggle to understand it.
There's very few individuals that I even would articulate that do what you are saying. As of right now, maybe someone, which I used to have a lot of respect for, I have little to no respect for him now. Maybe someone like Ben Shapiro is someone as you imagine, where he would bite the bullet, where he would say things like, the institutions will hold as long as he does right-wing things. That's right. All I care about because it's less dangerous than the left wing, that irrational viewpoint. But ultimately, in terms of what I see, what I very clearly define as whataboutism equating to what MAGA does right now is that they say that other things that Democrats have done in history is an example that is equatable to the actions taking place now. No matter how many facts, no how much details you go into, they try to make a one-to-one comparison. For example, when it comes down to the National Guard being sent out, they try to say, well, Dwight Eisenhower did the same thing, even though when you go into the history, he sent the National Guard to protect black people who were still in schools where segregation still existed. When you compare the situation regarding the meme coins, they try to compare it to insider trading, even though a lot of that I'm not a big fan of. Don't get me wrong. Not a big fan of.
Yeah, as if
ultimately
they love that too. As if they like insider trading. That's strange. Yeah, continue. Sorry.
No, you're correct. I don't like that either. But it's crazy how you can see that, and then you see a meme coin that has no intrinsic value. At the very least, when it comes to insider trading, they're trading things that have value to the economy itself. This is a meme coin that has no value, that the only reason why people would invest into it is so they can do secret meetings with Donald Trump. How corrupt can that be? And then there was another one you said, I forget.
Was it the January 6th thing?
Oh, the January 6th thing. They always bring up the BLM riots, they were so bad, even though this is an orchestrated effort by the president of the United States, whereas Joe Biden and many politicians denounced the riots in particular. There was some peaceful ones. Even I was going like, yo, why are you guys looting stores? Are you stupid? I was one of those people that went out there and defended Kyle Rittenhouse. That was a very unpopular thing for the left. But I was like, bro, that was self-defense. I'm not going to play this game. He obviously did self-defense. Y'all were doing some crazy stuff. But when people like myself, people that are on the left denounce it, politicians denounce it, MAGA can't do the same for January 6th. MAGA can't even equate it because this was an intentionality to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power, a principle. that was embedded into the United States of America since its inception. So none of the things that they bring up is equatable, but they try their hardest to frame Democrats as bad as Trump, fail every single time. But at the end of the day, as you said, the main point that you said, they don't care. They don't. It doesn't matter to them as long as Trump has power.
Yeah, I think what's frustrating is that the misinformation ring that kind of exists here is somewhat impossible to grapple with, because when I talk to some of my hyper Republican friends, they'll talk about January 6th and they're not necessarily, I did have some people who just wouldn't even engage with the bad stuff about January 6th because they wanted me to disavow the BLM riots. And I was like, yes, I disavow them. Can we talk about January 6th? But that wasn't enough, because he was just like, do you think it's worse? And I was like, dude, can we just talk about the badness of this particular issue? But the misinformation surrounding these things, I think, is somewhat justified from a normie perspective. Like when I hear about January 6th, they'll talk about it being a Fedsurrection. They'll say that these things didn't happen, or the corrupt politicians just want you to believe this. And these are what seemed to me to be obviously incorrect statements about reality. But if they were true, I can see why it would justify their thoughts on these issues. And so it's hard, because normal Republicans, when they talk about these things, what they're saying, if they were true, a lot of the times would be valid. I'm like, yeah, no, I would agree with you, but sadly that's not the case. And that, I think, is a harder thing to fix, to touch, because when we were yelling at crazy leftists, there was just philosophical grounding where it didn't necessarily matter as much what the truth was. What you were arguing for just shouldn't be the case. But with these kinds of things, there's a factual basis that they're hiding behind. How do you get over this? How do you resist this urge to just bring up fake facts? How do you do information?
So it's very tough when you engage with this. Before we started the podcast episode, for example, you brought up one of the recent videos I did in regards to talking about Steven Crowder. And one mistake that I did in that video is I should have just pulled up every single receipt of the claims that I make. I do not just say things for fluff. I do specify when things are vibey, when it's a more general understanding based off human nature. Some people can understand that and contextualize things, but even that is a very, very shallow way of kind of engaging in a true nuanced conversation. So in most videos I do, one of the recent Jubilee videos, I make sure that if I'm making a factual claim, I pull up the receipt. And then in the comment section, I hear nada, zip. I don't hear anything. Nothing is used as a response. So it doesn't really matter what the facts are necessarily. You have to really pick your poison. Do you want the engagement of the conversation and flushing it out to the point where you really get to the core of the belief system? And I do think there's something interesting behind there, because ultimately, if I just prove receipts and send all this and just, hey, show you how wrong you are, then they're just going to run away like cowards. But if I keep on engaging with the topic in place, I get to find out exactly who you are. And who a lot of these people are, not everybody, but a good chunk of them, boils down to some of the worst isms you can think of, whether it's racism, sexism, even the phobias, homophobic, transphobic. These people have these innate personal values that they are hiding behind this idea that they are attributing to facts, when in reality, they are using these narratives given to them by the MAGA machine. And even if you prove them wrong, it doesn't really matter. We see this on Jubilee all the time. I'm sure you've seen videos on that with Surrounded, or where a liberal debates a Republican. You tell them something, it goes in one ear, out's the other. So it's a nuance game. You have to really pick on, okay, what factual basis should I really tackle? And when it's more nuanced manner, I know that facts don't really matter. So you have to appeal to a core value, either try to empathize with what they truly care about with their family or their religion, or just find out exactly who they are. they just hate you because of X, Y, and Z, and you're never going to get through them until like maybe some traumatic thing happens, and we don't want that, of course.
Yeah, I will challenge you a little bit on the isms. I think that for maybe we can parse this together, but for me, I find it really difficult to attribute an ism to something that I could just say is ignorance or stupidity. And so like, I think that I don't think that, at least for a broad range of general Republicans, that there's an ism that is grounding their beliefs. And if it is, I think it's surface level. Like I think you could pierce through that pretty easily with some examples, and you'd find that it's actually something associated with race, not race exactly, or something associated with, something associated with gender, but not actually gendered, something like that. I don't know if you have more experience with this. I imagine you might.
So I'm not upset at what you're saying by any means. I do think it gets pretty tiring when you throw out loose labels out there. I've argued plenty of times throughout my past on the idea that every white person's racist. That's absolutely a foolish thought. Or you can't use the word racism when it comes to a white person because it's not systematic. Again, foolish thought. But ultimately, and I made sure I said some of them. I don't want to make a blanket term, but I do think we're seeing very consistently that a lot of the things that are being used to fuel some of the misinformation, the narratives that they're pushing, comes to core beliefs that is being very clearly defined as an ism. For example, when it comes down to one of the recent clips that I did, I talked about immigrants. And there's just a lot of misinformation about illegal immigrants getting health care. And it was very clear to me that in a debate with the left and the right, that this one righty was saying that, you know what, I want to take away healthcare from not illegal immigrants because they don't get healthcare. Under only emergency situations do you care for them, because like if they're literally have their arm chopped off, the ER is not going to go like, oh yeah, you're a legal immigrant. No, that they're not going to ask that. They're going to fix you. But there are circumstances where someone with temporary status, these are people who are here for protected reasons, or refugee status, protected reasons because they escaped from a dire, terrible situation. Yeah, they give a limited type of healthcare. And then I articulate that. I was like, you wouldn't want your family to come in this situation because you have to, not because you want to, escaping from this atrocity. It's okay for them to have limited healthcare, right? I see people saying, nope, we don't give out free healthcare. There's that disconnect of humanity there. They don't see them as a fellow human being. They see them as an outsider. And just because it's a misguided notion of what illegal immigrants or what immigrants are for the United States does not take away from that terrible negative ism that is obviously there when you are not truly treating the person as an equal. So I only can call it for what it is, because other than that, there's really no actual causal reason for you to think the way you do if I can't reach to your inner humanity. Once I get past that, then it's very clear on the type of individual I'm talking. Now, there are examples where you actually have a fair point. When people try to articulate stuff about black people, for example, and saying that there are certain neighborhoods that are very terrible, if you're going to a certain black neighborhood that's super poor, it could be very dangerous. And that is an undeniable reality. But however, when you make misguided notions and making a universal claim about black people, then at that point, it gets very, very shaky, because if I make a correlated term to that, or correlated comparison to that, it was like, well, I don't want to go in the middle of nowhere in America, in the Midwest, in a very countryside as a black person. What do you think will happen to me? But they're not engaging with that. Then at that point, it's like, it's not about race-based stereotypes based off very reasonable conclusions. It's about bringing down a type of person because you want to see them as lesser, or you want to take away benefits from them, or you want to do X, Y, and Z. So generally, I would agree, but as of right now, the climate is shaping out where they are feeding onto these narratives to not only bring down the individual, but also because they want to benefit themselves.
Yeah, I'm able to grasp. I definitely liked a lot of that when it came down to the examples of like black people and the way that they're viewed. But I do think that with particularly the immigration case, I'm struggling to see. I can definitely see the lack of humanity in that argument, but I'm struggling to see a little bit of like the ism, so like the racism or maybe the like nationalism or something like that. Because to me, I feel like if you ask the same question but for like a Canadian who's like a white Canadian or something, I feel like a lot of people would have the same consistency that they shouldn't be provided that health care. And so that is like a dehumanization, like that is a dehumanizing belief of sorts. But I think that it's very different than like an intrinsic type of hate for a specific nationality or group. Unless it would be like all nationalities other than an American nationality. Now, when you dig deeper and you question like what it means to be an American, you're probably going to catch a lot of whiteness in that. But I think that comes from ignorance in what they themselves actually believe. And like you could find examples of Americans who are not white that they'd be like, yeah, hell yeah, those guys are Americans. And I feel like this is true for all people. I just feel like you lose a lot of utility when you claim that the immigration argument is inherently racist, when I feel like there exists an argument that maybe people shouldn't actually believe or agree with, but isn't race-based or isn't racist inherently. I guess I wonder if you have thoughts or have things that you have heard that kind of parse this distinction.
So I wouldn't ever make the claim that the argument itself is inherently racist. I'm talking about individuals based off experience. So I'm only speaking on what is shown to me. And I would also disagree with that kind of anecdotal experience, and that is fine for what you've experienced. But I do think that there is a difference between white Canadians and white Europeans that are being treated versus Hispanics in particular, but also Asians or people that are coming from the Middle East, for example. I think that it also shaped itself out in terms of the idea that, I forget which court case or which judge said this, but they're starting to allow a certain level of race-based discrimination where they see Hispanic and can automatically assume that they're an illegal immigrant. I think there's something there to really state that I doubt they're going up to random white people and doing the same thing. I feel like it's very clear that there is individuals that are going to be looking at people moving forward that are sounding different, looking different. And I do think it's a very clear subsection. I don't think that reality follows a white Canadian or a white European at all, to be honest. So that's a little bit anecdotal. There's no data to really back that up. That's more vibes, but I am very comfortable in saying that claim based off the actions of the MAGA administration and the people involved themselves. So that's just kind of how we differ. As for the conversation of substance, because that's important. When you're having an actual conversation in terms of immigration, I do not start it out by saying, oh, you're racist. It doesn't really solve anything. It doesn't really get into the meat on what we are talking about. I've talked about someone individually before. He was a Republican before the recent election. And we talked about immigration. There are some things I disagreed with, but I was able to convince him eventually that, okay, I agree. We should have more resources at the wall. We should have more judges. We should be a little bit more strict on certain people that are coming in. And when it comes to the asylum process, there are some like disagreements, factual disagreements, of course, and certain things that he says as a Border Patrol agent that I just don't believe he's telling the truth about. It could be a mischaracterization. You can have that in any field. But ultimately, what I really wanted to do is find a level of understanding. We did. I made him agree, hesitantly, but I made him agree that, okay, what if we streamline the immigration process so people can get in better when we make it more strict so obviously criminals can't get in? He thought about it. He didn't say yes immediately, but eventually okay, I would agree. Now, that was maybe a year and a half ago. Would he agree now? I don't know. But the point is, when I'm having a substantive conversation with some meaningful dialogue, then yes, we could talk about the immigration process right now. It's very flawed, especially the asylum process. But there is certain individuals when you know very clearly that this is a conversation that we're not really getting to the meat of what is actually going on. There's no reality that we're going to be able to meet in the middle. It's a misguided notion based off ignorance. Ignorance is not an excuse for being a terrible person. And if you're a terrible person, then you can be quantified or qualified as an ism. You can. If you don't want to work past what your misguided notion is saying, then I can't do anything but call you who you are. So they say perception is reality, obviously. So I hate to do that, but there's really no point of me trying to give you the benefit of the doubt if you show me who you are. So that's probably where we differ.
Yeah, and I don't want to push on this too hard. I do think that with that particular implementation of stopping people specifically because of their race, I wonder, like, if that were to, well, one, with like the Canadian example, I think that's just like there's just a practical difference between enacting those two policies. So like the ability to tell the difference between a white American and a Canadian American, I imagine, is impossible or like close to very difficult. Whereas the difference between like any sort of, white race or any different kind of colored race would be easier. Now, I'm not saying that this justifies the intention, because it doesn't. But I think that if you were to take on this like Republican mindset of getting immigrants out of the country, you could look at it pragmatically, and then kind of like with the stop and frisk, I think that was put out under the assumption that it would be more effective, like it would increase the numbers of people that were detained because of the stop and frisk implementation. And then they found out that it did not increase any accuracy in detaining people, so they stopped doing it. And so maybe that's the kind of avenue that Republicans are trying to take with this kind of immigration policy. I think that we're getting into like super dangerous territory, especially with the deportation of that one guy who was supporting Hamas. I thought that was like insane. Like, we should not be deporting people for that. So I see the slippery slope, but I would still just challenge the idea, just like the racist allegation for this kind of policy. I don't know. It's probably very likely to be racist, but I don't know if we could say that it is. Like, I can see a steel man that doesn't involve race that allows for this kind of policy.
I do want to be very clear. I am not saying that the policy itself inherently, I do not come into the conversation saying it's racist.
Right.
What I'm saying is that based off conversations I have, or based off what I hear from individuals, I'll call that individual racist. So this is not a blanket term. Just because you support immigration or deportations more specifically doesn't make you inherently racist. But I do think actions can create a very clear picture of who someone is, and that's what I go based off. I don't think it's very appropriate to really come into a conversations coming with a very perceived idea of who they are based off very limited experience and knowledge. But I do think there are certain actions, and I think you would agree, if someone did a certain thing, you can make a very clear distinction that this action is a turning point on defining who you are. So that's where I'm coming out of it in terms of experience and who you are telling me is who I'm calling you. And then as for the situation regarding the deportations, and there was something else you said. I'm just blanking.
I brought up stop and frisk as like an example of utility, or like.
Oh yes, correct. You did say that. I mean, it's hard for me to give Republicans any leeway at this point. I think they've
right.
a lot of them have been getting very confident saying that we don't want immigrants at all. So we're kind of reaching the point where it's not just, illegal immigrants. And even though we tell them statistics about, crime, and illegal immigrants are helping the economy, and illegal immigrants, areas where they do not actually increase crime, it doesn't really matter. And I think they're getting a little bit more bold in saying, you know what, we just don't want these people in the country in general. And that also plays into the conversation of what it means to be helpful to America, because I think that conversation is kind of moving towards that. But my last thing is my anecdotal experience in terms of something that is very clear and defining is I watched this recent conversation between Michael Knowles and Adam Mockler and this other woman. And there was this one guy talking about how great deportations are and Trump is. And he was a white looking guy. They find out that he was European and that he was not from America. And Michael Knowles just showered him with praise because obviously he was agreeing with them. So that really helped, of course. But I just doubt when it comes down to these circumstances, situations where at this point, that same type of energy will be kept for other types of individuals, especially when the idea is that you're getting treated a lot differently when it comes down to especially Hispanics in America. I understand what you're saying. Don't get me wrong. But I do think as of right now, it's hard for me to say if I'm an Hispanic walking around America, do I feel safe? Do I feel like these people won't treat me differently? Do I feel like that I can just live my normal life at this point? Even a Haitian, compared to if I feel like I'm Canadian or European, do I feel like I'm threatened in America? Yes, it could be more difficult, but I doubt that is what they're really going after. I do think there's a want for a very specific type of American.
Yeah.
And certain people don't fit that bill.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think Destiny brought up something that I thought was really interesting, where he was saying, like, why on earth would you support immigration from these, like, these European countries where all of them are significantly more left-leaning than, like, the Catholic Mexicans who are coming down, you know, like, why on earth would we support these? What I will say is that the puzzle piece that's here, and the reason why I brought up this, like, distinction between racism and policy, is that it feels like a lot of the immigration debate is like a war on proxies. It's like, well, this is a proxy for this, and I don't like this, and since this has this kind of proxy, and so it's like people are struggling to separate race from culture, from action, from statistics, like stuff like they're struggling to separate this. For an example, they'll say something along the lines of like, well, I just don't want like cartel members to come here. And then they think like, okay, like where would cartel members come from? Probably not from Canada, probably not from European countries. They're probably coming from Mexico. There might be some statistical backing that supports this kind of idea. And so now they're like, how are we going to make laws to prevent the cartel from coming here? Well, we probably want to stop immigration from Mexico because that's where the cartel people are statistically more likely to come from. It's like, well, how do we do that? And so it's like, well, I see somebody who's Mexican. What is the likelihood that they are from the cartel? Extremely low, but more likely than maybe if I see a white person, something like that. And so then you kind of like boil this down to why do they not want Mexicans here? It's not even because they're Mexican. It has nothing to do maybe with even culturally, like whether they're bringing culturally Mexicans. Everybody loves Mexican food, right? Even these like racist people, right? Something like that. And it's not because their skin is Mexican. It's because of this association between Mexicans and the cartel. And the battle to like separate that from the left wing perspective, who just wants to automatically call these people racist because of this association. That's not exactly true. And to separate from these right people, like these right wing people, to be like, well, no, Mexicans bring a ton of amazing stuff to this country that we should be supportive of. And we can't deport people who aren't involved in the cartel just because they're Mexican. And so it's this battle of like associations and proxies that I find we've just lost all the plot on both sides, but especially the right is the bad side here recently because of the way that they've just like blown up these proxies. I don't know if you agree with this kind of idea. I might be giving too much charity to the right in this kind of description, but how do you feel about the way that this has been described?
If we're having a real nuanced conversation in terms of the data and the policies, it's very clearly defined, or it's very clear to articulate what is actually going on regarding the immigration issue. A lot of people taking advantage of the asylum situation. A lot of people taking advantage of circumstances where they are able to come into the country waiting for the application. And because we don't have enough judges, it's hard to really figure out how to get them all through. A lot of people are waiting here for years and they can't really do anything about it because of how slow the process is. So we can really have a very nuanced and very important conversation with, fringe examples of, terrible association of terrible people creating a very misguided notion of an entire people. Of course, that's not exactly what the conversation is about, though. And I agree that it does have proxies, characteristics that are creating these unfortunate kind of reasoning behind why people advocate for certain things. Dare I say, though, it does get a little frustrating, which is why I'm a little sympathetic to the left when they make claims that when it comes down to mass shootings, who's doing that, right? Very clear of the type of people that's doing that. They have a very specific look, very specific skin color. We have the most mass shootings in all the developed countries. The situation does not seem dwindling. And yes, it's not a very large percentage, just like the amount of cartel members that are coming in the country, but it's still a percentage that we want to decrease. For some reason, a lot of people on the right just don't want to have that conversation. They don't want to have that dialogue. They don't want to engage with it further. So these proxies can be interruptive of a serious conversation. However, if you want to really push policy and push advocacy, one thing that is undeniable at this point that I've come to know is you have to get people emotionally involved. And that is what people are doing. They're creating an enemy. I don't like it. Don't get me wrong. I don't like when people do this. I think it's very inappropriate, but it's the most effective strategy, which is MAGA, what they realize. They're painting transphobes as all pedophiles, trans people as all pedophiles. They're painting the Hispanic people as cartel members. They're painting black people as gang members. Easy to get them emotionally involved and point the gun at very specific individuals that are different from you. And they're not going to do that when it comes to white people in mass shootings or white people in serial killers. That doesn't help the cause. So I do think it's a problem. But when it comes down to this situation and when it comes down to the majority of people, it's hard to really deny that they keep on falling for it and then they keep on doing it and they keep on looking at these narratives and believing in it. You can understand why people who are fighting in the less powerful position would call it out as what it is. So I understand. I'm sympathetic to the minority population because that's what it is, the minority population. But if we're having a real conversation, I do think it gets in the way.
Yeah, I think you're pretty apt on that. I think a frustrating thing, and this is just statistically true, is that the majority is much harder to represent than any minority group. So because what population of the United States is white? It has to be above 50%, right? I mean, it's a large majority of the people. So you lose descriptive power on what that group of people is actually like because they're so large. Whereas these minority groups can be painted as all encompassing this one thing because it's much easier to separate them into groups. You have Black, you have Hispanic, you have Asian, you have Latin American, you have a bunch of different groups, but white people, they're just white. And so there's not a distinction. So the point you make about people who are shooting up places, that is a really important point. But the public, it's much harder for them to grasp this because white is the majority. And so you lose descriptive power because you can't separate the groups. And it makes it very easy to paint a group of people as an enemy because they exist in a minority group. They're easier to identify. If I say that white people are school shooters, that doesn't bring me any closer to disliking a specific group of people. Whereas if I say black people are, all criminals, that brings me way closer to identifying a specific group of people because they're just a minority group already. And so I think that that's a very unfortunate power that the Republicans have been using to make enemies. I want to get a little bit into local politics.
One thing I'll say to that is that in general, I understand And I do think there's a lot of credence to what you're saying, especially if you have a wide enough encompassing viewpoint of what society is like. But based off experience, you can still paint that very broad brush with limited experience, especially if most of the individuals you're coming across are those that are, let's say, a racist white guy against a black guy, for example, or a cop that is doing you wrong. You can still create very specific notions of a group of people, regardless of how large the individual population is, based off experience themselves. And if we're talking about the minority population and the way that they're being characterized now, if the news constantly says the people doing mass shootings are white people, or if there's the news saying that white cops are doing these racist things against black people, I just want to specify these are all things that I do think is very lazy reporting, but ultimately they can create a very clear narrative. And now we've reached the point where when it comes to MAGA, we have a very clear picture of what they look like. So basically, if you're a minority, you have all the negative perceptions in the world about what white people are in America. And I do think, even though it's not creating a very specific caricature of who they are, the combination of all these negative caricatures can still create a very clear point of reference on who they are to the minority population. But with that said, I don't think that is a smart way to engage if you were a politician or if you're engaging in politics, because that's also one of the reasons why we lost the elections. We lost the white vote, which is something that people need to recognize.
That's interesting. I might be identifying a similar cause, but not the cause, in that there's also, like, the more people in a group that you have, that's more power that you have to believe a certain thing as well, which is also important to understand too. Yeah, that makes sense though. That makes sense. With the political scene broadly and then like the local scene, I wonder, you're on the internet, you know, people from all over the world are commenting on your stuff having never met you. That is a very different experience than the local stuff that you've been doing. I guess I want to hear about the differences between like this internet persona and then this like local political group. Like, what are the differences between being a politician like globally on the internet versus being a politician locally in Ohio?
I'll be honest. When it comes to people on the internet, I truly don't give much people credence at all. If you're willing to engage in a very good faith conversation, I will respond. But a lot of people are just a number, and they're bots, a lot of them. And let's be very clear, there's two type of factors you always have to consider. That there are individuals that want to stir up the pot. Those exist. We know they exist. And then there's, bots out there that is also intended to stir up the pot. So there are external forces that want to keep America divided. You also have to keep that in mind as well. And you can kind of tell them apart, but, some people can't. No profile picture, certain type of names, stuff like that. Ultimately, when it comes to the internet, I don't really care much about what people are saying on the internet. I have pretty thick skin. Most people don't. And that's, it's really up to your personality. Local politics is more important because I do think it's very important to talk to people and treat people like people. I've always had this very clear way of engaging into fruitful conversation. We got to talk. We have to have a conversation. Some people are not brave enough to say certain things to your face. And then other people are even less brave to say it even over the internet on a call. When you really have a conversation with someone, you're able to engage on what the person truly thinks and who they truly are. And that's important. When it comes to local politics, when I'm talking to people, I do want to engage with individuals where they're at and what they are thinking. When it comes down to impact in your community, the best way to do it ultimately is to hear people out, listen to them. This is why Mamdani is so effective in New York right now, is listening to people and reacting to what they are saying. So don't get me wrong, internet national attention is very, very, very important. But a very interesting story I heard maybe a year ago is how there was this one new traffic light in this one intersection. That traffic light really irritated an old woman because that wasn't there before. So what she did is she kept on going to City Hall until it was removed, individually, by herself. They eventually removed it. You'll be surprised on how easy it is to contact your local politician, how honestly not known they are, and how you can individually make a huge impact in your community. So I dare I say, if you want change, get more involved, because a lot of people who are involved do not have your best interests in mind. Trust me.
Yeah, I think that this is getting into some complicated political theory, but I guess you kind of already did it a little bit. But can you make the sell for like maybe some other benefits of getting into local politics? I feel like people misunderstand the amount of work it takes to make change and how helpful they could be in making that change, no matter what side it is. So like I went to the No Kings protest just to like people watch, just to understand like what was going on, just to see like this is a political machine that's working right now. And you had people like standing in the rain, working at a booth, like handing out, and they're not getting paid at all. And it's like that was so helpful to get the message out there on how people can do it. But when you ask somebody who believes in some of these values, who believe in the No Kings protest values, would you work at this event? Would you sacrifice 5 hours of your day to go do this? A lot of people would say no, because they don't realize how powerful doing something like that could be. But I wonder if you can speak a little bit to the power that people can have politically in making some of these changes.
I think the best way to articulate how you as an individual and the people you know can make an impact is really articulating on who's stopping you. There's a conversation I had recently, and I spoke about the home crisis, where people can't afford homes. A lot of people are very upset about it. Understandably so. We all want a home. We want to raise our family there. It's kind of like the American dream that you've been told as a kid, right? He's in California, and they're doing their best to kind of change the way the current policies are working in terms of owning a home, renting a home, decreasing the value of homes, all these different factors. They're struggling. Why are they struggling? Because there is specific entities that exist in the local community that have a lot of backing, that care, that have an incentive to keep housing prices the same. There are people who want to keep it the same because they don't care about their own individual value to eventually sell their home. They don't want the decreased pricing of their home to fall. So of course, you may want to afford a home, but they don't give a shit about you. They care about their own home and their own incentive and their own benefit. So there's a good number of people. There are people who want to buy up all the homes, rent them out, get rich off that. We all seen that individual like content creators go out there. Oh, let me tell you this scheme about how you can buy up a condo and get rich. Those people exist. And yes, they don't get paid to advocate and do all this planning. But what they do get is all of you guys not caring and the policies working in their favor. So it may not seem like you can make immediate change as an individual. It gets very disheartening when it comes to the federal election, of course. But you must understand that there are individuals that do know the value of local politics, do know the value of local change, do know the value of minute power that can make extraordinary change in your community, and they're taking advantage of your unwillingness to get involved. So I think that's very important to consider, that the people who want you to stay down, they're working for it. So if you want to be complacent, if you want to be a mindless drone, then that's exactly what they are asking you to do. So that, I think the best way for people to understand is really making it very clear that if you're not doing it, someone else will.
Yeah, I think that's a really good understanding of how political powers, like the vacuum will be filled with people who are going to take advantage of the fact that you're not doing something. I also think another important aspect of it too is understanding that you might, whether it be your choice or not, fall into the category of group who needs help, who needs support from other people. And you'll realize very quickly how important it is that we can build communities that help other people. Like I always use the example for like people who are like handicapped, they're missing legs. They need those ramps built into buildings so that they can actually get into them. You do not realize how serious of a problem that is until your legs get cut off and you need to face the fact that you can't even get into some of these buildings. And you realize very quickly that there's an advocacy group that installs those ramps into buildings. And if you would have participated in it earlier, maybe you'd have ramps quicker. But by the time you lose your legs, it's too late to take advantage of those things. And that's, to me, exactly how local politics works as well. And that like you have a community that is fighting for your city right now, and you won't understand the benefits that you could have been receiving because you weren't involved. You weren't there to push for it. And so you're not taking advantage of the fact that your local place could help you. And that's just going to bite you in the butt when unforeseen circumstances happen or foreseen circumstances happen. So I think that's an important aspect of it too. I guess particularly in Ohio, what are some of the changes that you are advocating for? What are some of the graspable things that the people in your area could be changing or implementing that you're kind of like voicing?
So I really want to engage in very specific conversations with certain politicians, and I've been in contact here and there. We just got to put pen to paper and have a very fruitful conversation. A few things that are happening in Ohio or have happened in Ohio are things that I, at the very least, advocate for, is that there's one thing that I implore you to look into, as well as your audience, something called star voting. It's a voting reform. I don't think a lot of people know about the value of voting reform because it's not something that is a high value topic. One thing that they may have heard of is something called ranked choice voting. And that has certain inefficiencies that are as being basically backfiring on the idea of alternate voting methods. But, you know, people were talking about it quite a bit when it comes to the New York mayoral election regarding Mamdani, even though it didn't really play a large factor. But there are really, really good voting reforms out there. And one that I've gotten involved that are learning about it from, I think it was a Mr. Beat video. And then eventually I contacted them and spoke with the person in charge, Sarah Wolk. She's a great person. And then there's a guy in Ohio, in Columbus, Duncan Cior. He is trying to push star voting and help it get implemented as much as possible in Ohio. So different voting reform methods could help people feel like their vote actually matters, you know, not just, oh man, I hate both, but this person I hate a little bit less. Star voting allows you to give your opinion, your true thoughts about every candidate on the billing, and then rank them or rate them from 1 through 5. And regardless of what happens, your vote will have value no matter who moves on to the next round. So I very much advocate for voting reform nowadays. We should be able to do this now. The current way we're doing things is too inefficient, allowing individuals that a lot of people don't like. Other things that I do think is important that I've heard that people say, well, one thing that is very important, Vivek Ramaswamy, we can't allow to win governor in America, in Ohio. Vivek is a MAGA shill. He is a bootlicker. And we've seen it in Tennessee when the governor of Memphis, governor of Tennessee, allowed the National Guard to come into Memphis. Vivek will do the exact same thing. He will allow them to come into Columbus or Cincinnati. So ensuring that they vote for someone that's not Vivek, whether that's Amy Acton or whoever else wants to run, that's very important. And I've been telling people that this is something you need to pay attention to if you don't want the military occupying the state of Ohio. Some other minor things that I've talked to people that people care about is obviously grocery prices, you know, prices of homes. Pretty normal stuff that a lot of people are caring about in America right now. So those are a few things that I do think are very important to pay attention to in this crazy world we live in the MAGA administration.
Yeah, I think the voting reform, I think, is some of the most jarring for people because I don't think people realize that they can influence that stuff. Like it seems like something that is so set in stone that we just have to vote this way. And it takes local advocates to tell you like, hey, no, we could actually like change the way that we vote, and it might get certain people elected, especially in regards to keeping track of who the least favorite candidate is super important. So it's like who you want to be president is a very probably the most important metric, but who you would hate the most to have president is kind of important as well. And sometimes that might be a different result than, you know, what actually ends up getting elected. So I think that's really interesting. I guess I'm confused if you could make the sell specifically for star voting. Like, how possible is that? Like, how attainable is this, and what would it take from, you know, the viewer right now to make that a possibility?
It's a long-term plan. People have to keep in mind, star voting is relatively new from my memory. I think it probably got kickstarted around the 2010s. Compare that to ranked choice voting, which has been here since the 1900s, around like maybe the 90s, maybe the 80s, maybe before that. I don't remember exactly, but it's been around far longer. It has a lot more institution in terms of the framework of the people involved, the name recognition. I mean, people talking about it all the time regarding the New York mayoral race, as I said before. So in comparison, it has a lot to go. It has a lot to do, but it's relatively new, and it's doing some bits in Oregon. They're trying to expand their reach. Sarah and a bunch of the other people on regarding star voting is really trying to get out there and have these conversations. Anytime that I speak with someone who cares about different types of ways to improve the country, I always direct them right to Sarah's direction. Hey, go talk to her. I think that's very important. There's other methods that are kind of under the umbrella of like alternate voting methods that a lot of them are aligned with, that is kind of separate from ranked choice voting. They're kind of like the old heads that refuse to give up the way of life. But there's like other things like approval voting that people think that is very effective, ranked robin that people think is very effective as well. So for a relatively new voting reform method that is trying to get out the gate running, as of right now, in terms of any issues people have with star voting, there's really no good ones. Nobody has brought up a real critique of it compared to like ranked choice voting and its inefficiencies, and it's gaining a decent amount of ground considering everybody who starts to use it. The only reason why people would not use it, for the most part, from my understanding, is a little bit of like politics or like unwillingness to change, as you said prior. So I do think it's doing a pretty good job, all things considered.
Yeah, well, we've been going on for a little bit more than an hour, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of wrap this episode up. If there's any plugging that you would like to do for your, you know, channel or any of your organizations, I would really encourage you take this opportunity to do that. But also any broader themes or messages that you want people who have made it this far into the episode to take home. This is really your opportunity to kind of close this out and preach a little bit.
All right, sounds good. Well, you can go check out the podcast, Purple Political Breakdown. For the most part, I try to post every Sunday, Tuesday, Saturday, and Thursday. There might be some exceptions, but they usually post on 8 a.m. EST, and I cover a variety of different topics, try to have open panel conversations, try to focus on local politics, which is a relatively new thing, discussing on issues in Ohio in particular, talk about the news and breaking it down, or having guest episodes, as I plan to have our boy here eventually in the future. So when it comes down to it, my goal, the quotes, the headline that I put for the podcast itself is focusing on political solutions without political bias. Now, people may get a little confused, like, but don't you hate MAGA? Yes, but it's not because I'm biased against MAGA. It's because I see them and I think they're bad. It's simple as that. So highly recommend really focusing on productive dialogue and political solutions. There's a lot of different organizations that I advocate for that I do think are very good. I guess if I'm going to name a few, a platform called Informed, I have them on, and they're a simple news media outlet where they send a very quick nitpicks to your phone every single morning so people can get more informed on the news with unbiased, very factual based information. Star voting is another one that I'm a big advocate for, of course. The Independent Center, who is focusing on informing people about voting in a very nuanced, neutral way. They're definitely way more center than I am, for sure. So a lot of things I advocate for, but ultimately, one of the things that I really care about that people should always remember is that you can have a very productive, very very matter of fact, not toxic conversation with people if you really truly intend to, because ultimately, if you want to believe this, when it comes down to it, if there's a car on fire and there's a child in that car and most people are walking by that car, I think a lot of people would have the necessary innate instinct to save the child, work together to save the child. So if we get beyond this kind of political toxicity, you can really get down to the nature that most people are probably good people. They're just kind of getting enveloped in the webs of current politics.
Yeah, I think it's a really great way to round it out. But thank you so much for coming on, and I'm thankful that we had this awesome conversation.
Appreciate you for having me on, for sure.